Marcus Chen stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, gazing down at the city that seemed to bow before his feet. At 52 years old, with a net worth exceeding $87 billion, Marcus had become accustomed to a world where nothing was impossible, where every whim could be satisfied within moments, and where people existed primarily to serve his vision. His empire stretched across technology, real estate, pharmaceuticals, and energy sectors, touching the lives of millions without them ever knowing his name. The irony was lost on him, and honestly it never even occurred to him that irony might exist in such circumstances. He had purchased an entire downtown revitalization project in a struggling Pennsylvania town, simply because one of his engineers had mentioned it casually during a lunch meeting. The project would eventually make him another $500 million, maybe more, and it would be celebrated as his philanthropic gesture. Though philanthropy was merely a vehicle for profit, in his carefully constructed worldview. That morning, as his personal assistant reviewed his schedule, with characteristic trembling nervousness, Marcus learned about the garage situation. It was one of 47 properties in the Riverside neighborhood acquisition, scheduled to be demolished to make way for the Crown Plaza development, a glittering mixed-use complex that would generate extraordinary returns for his investors, and, more importantly, for himself. The property report described the garage as dilapidated, obsolete, an eyesore, and listed 36 other terms designed to justify its destruction. A single dad named David Richardson occupied it, running some sort of repair operation, the report noted dismissively, as though the man were nothing more than an inconvenient tenant to be relocated with minimal compensation. Marcus had seen the report in passing, approved the demolition timeline with a casual wave of his hand, and thought nothing more about it until today. What changed today was that David Richardson had hired a lawyer, not a good lawyer, mind you, but a persistent one, who had discovered a contractual technicality that would delay the demolition process by 6 months. This was unacceptable. Marcus did not accept delays. His time was worth roughly $100,000 per hour, and he could not fathom that a single dad mechanic thought his little garage was worth more than that. So he did what he always did when confronted with resistance. He decided to personally handle it. He would go to Pennsylvania, see this pathetic operation for himself, understand the man's desperation, and either convince him voluntarily to sell or intimidate him into submission. Marcus had not met serious resistance in almost a decade, and he had forgotten what it felt like to have his will questioned. His security team was assembled by noon. His private jet was fueled by 1 o'clock. By 3 in the afternoon, Marcus Chen was standing in the parking lot of a grimy garage in Riverside, Pennsylvania. With his Italian leather shoes crunching on gravel, his $10,000 suit gathering dust, and his face registering the kind of disdain usually reserved for biohazard sites. The garage was indeed a dump. Marcus had not exaggerated the assessment in his mind. If anything, the photographs in the report had been generous. The main structure sagged in places where the foundation had settled unevenly. The corrugated metal siding was rusted through in multiple locations, with several panels missing entirely to reveal the skeletal frame beneath. The parking area was a minefield of potholes, with grease stains so old they had achieved geological status. Several vehicles in various states of disrepair were scattered about, looking less like cars and more like automotive tombs. Above the entrance, a homemade sign reading Richardson's Garage hung at a precarious angle, held up by a single chain that looked like it had survived since the Eisenhower administration. Marcus could smell the oil and rust from where he stood, and he could not understand how any human being, particularly one with a child, could voluntarily work in such conditions. He checked his watch, a $100,000 Patek Philippe, and prepared to deliver what he imagined would be a brief, decisive conversation. His security chief, a man named Thomas who had been with him for 15 years, maintained a respectful distance as Marcus approached the garage. "I'll give you 5 minutes," Marcus said to Thomas without breaking stride. "Just time for a preliminary assessment, then we'll bring Mr. Richardson outside and make him an offer he can't refuse. Probably offer him triple what his property is actually worth, just to wrap this up and get to the airport." Thomas nodded, having learned long ago that Marcus did not expect responses to his proclamations, only acknowledgement that they had been heard. The moment Marcus pushed through the garage doors, his eyes narrowed. The interior was darker than expected, lit only by the afternoon sun, streaming through the gaps in the siding. As his vision adjusted, he found himself in a cavernous space that seemed far larger than the exterior suggested. Workbenches lined every wall, organized with meticulous precision. Tools hung from pegboards that had been painted and maintained with clear care. The concrete floor, while stained, had been recently swept, and Marcus could actually smell the faint scent of cleaning solution mixing with the dominant petroleum smell. A man emerged from the shadows of the garage's rear section, wiping his hands on a cloth that had once been white. David Richardson was not what Marcus expected. He was younger, perhaps early 40s, with strong, calloused hands that told stories of honest labor. His face was weathered but intelligent, lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying responsibility rather than from simple fatigue. He wore a faded work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing a tattoo on his forearm that Marcus would later discover was his son's initials wrapped in a mechanical design. What struck Marcus most was the man's eyes. They were not frightened or submissive, the way Marcus expected the eyes of desperate working people to be. Instead, they held something that might have been described as dignity, mixed with a kind of weary resignation. "Can I help you?" David asked, already moving toward Marcus with an extended hand. His grip was firm, and his expression was welcoming despite the fact that he was clearly sizing up this stranger in the immaculate suit standing in his garage. Marcus did not appreciate being sized up, so he withdrew his hand quickly and launched into his prepared monologue. About the development project, the inevitable progress of the market, the generous offer that would be made, and the foolishness of resisting. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes, and he was quite proud of the eloquence with which he presented these arguments. When he finished, he waited for David to crumble, to accept the inevitable, to acknowledge the superior force being marshaled against him. Instead, David simply nodded slowly and said, "I appreciate you coming down in person. Not many men in your position would do that, but I can't sell. Not today anyway." Marcus blinked. He had not expected those words. "I'm not asking you to decide today," he said, his voice carrying the careful patience one might use with a child. "I'm asking you to understand the situation. You have 6 months, maybe a year if you fight hard, but eventually this property will be acquired. Progress is inevitable. Why not make it profitable for yourself?" David led Marcus deeper into the garage, toward the rear section where he had emerged from moments earlier. "Walk with me for a minute," he said. And there was something in his tone that made Marcus follow, though he was not accustomed to taking directives from anyone. They descended a set of concrete steps that the darkness had made invisible from the front of the garage. Marcus found himself in what appeared to be a basement workshop, and his breath caught, not from surprise exactly, but from something more profound. The basement was another world entirely. The basement workshop was illuminated by professional-grade LED lighting, and it revealed a space that belonged in a museum of mechanical excellence, rather than beneath a dilapidated garage in rural Pennsylvania. The walls were lined with engineering books, some vintage, some modern, many in languages Marcus didn't recognize. In the center of the room sat a workbench that had to be 15 feet long, and upon it rested what Marcus's untrained eye recognized as an engine, but not just any engine. This was something extraordinary, something that spoke of obsession, genius, and countless hours of dedicated labor. Around the engine were various component parts, all meticulously organized and labeled. Blueprints covered one entire wall, and Marcus could see they were handwritten, detailed, marked with calculations and notes in a precise engineer's hand. Another corner of the basement held a library of sorts. Shelves containing thousands of technical manuals, journals, mathematical textbooks, and what appeared to be original patents dating back to the early 20th century. Marcus stood in the center of this impossible space and felt something shift within him. A sensation he had not experienced since early childhood. It was not wonder, exactly, because Marcus had trained himself long ago to dismiss wonder as an emotional indulgence. But it was something adjacent to wonder, some suppressed capacity for recognition that he was standing in the presence of genuine achievement. "What is this?" he asked quietly, and he was disturbed to find that his usual commanding tone had abandoned him. David smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from him, and gestured toward the engine. This is what I've been working on for the past 8 years, David said. It's a fully functional internal combustion engine that operates at nearly 98% efficiency. Current engines operate at around 40 to 45% efficiency. Every major automotive company has either rejected this design or tried to steal it. I've had lawyers send me cease and desist letters from manufacturers worth 10 times my net worth, and I've had offers to buy the design for amounts that would make most people comfortable for life. Marcus walked toward the engine, drawn by something he couldn't name. Up close, it was beautiful in a way that defied his understanding of how machines could be beautiful. Every component seemed to flow into the next, with an organic inevitability. There was intelligence here, the evidence of a mind operating at a level Marcus suddenly recognized as superior to his own, though he would never admit this aloud. "Why haven't you sold it?" Marcus asked. David leaned against one of the workbenches, his expression becoming more complicated. "Because my son asked me not to," he said. "He's 9 years old. 3 years ago he watched a documentary about climate change. I remember him coming home from school, crying about what the world would look like when he was an adult. He asked me if there was anything I could do to help. I told him about this engine project. I'd been dabbling with it for years at that point, just in my spare time, nothing serious, but then he made a decision. He said he wanted to help me make it perfect, because he said it could help save the world. So I promised him that I wouldn't sell the engine until it was truly perfect, and that when I did sell it, it would only be to a company that would actually use it to change how vehicles are manufactured. Most manufacturers aren't interested because the engine is incompatible with their current production systems. They'd have to retool entire factories. They'd have to redesign vehicles. It would cost them billions of dollars, and it would take a decade to recoup those losses. So they either ignore it or try to bury it. Marcus felt something he rarely experienced anymore, genuine curiosity. "What's your son's name?" he asked. "Thomas, same as your security guy's name, I'm guessing." David gestured toward the garage entrance. "I named him after Thomas Edison. My parents were both engineers, and my house growing up was full of biographies of inventors and scientists. That's why I started learning about engines in the first place. My father used to say that real achievement isn't about making money. It's about solving problems that matter." That stuck with me, probably more than it should have. Marcus turned away from David and examined the blueprints more carefully. His mind was already beginning to process what he was seeing, to translate the mechanical into the financial. An engine at 98% efficiency would revolutionize the automotive industry. It would shift the entire power structure of global manufacturing. It would be worth trillions of dollars if implemented across the industry, and it was sitting in a basement beneath a dilapidated garage, maintained by a single father and his 9-year-old son as a labor of love. "How much money do you need?" Marcus asked suddenly. The question surprised them both. David's expression shifted into something more guarded. "I don't need money," he said carefully. "I need someone to care more about the future than about quarterly earnings. I need a company that will implement this technology because it's right, not because it's profitable." Marcus laughed then, a short, sharp sound that seemed to disturb the careful silence of the basement. "You're naive," he said, not unkindly. "That company doesn't exist. Every company in the world is ultimately motivated by profit. It's not evil, it's just the nature of commerce." David's face hardened slightly. "Then I guess Thomas and I will keep working on it until it does exist, or until we make enough individual modifications that 40 different companies can each use a slightly different version of the technology. It'll take longer, but eventually, it'll be too big to suppress." Marcus looked at David more carefully then, truly looking at him. What he saw was a man completely uninterested in his wealth, unimpressed by his position, and unafraid of his power. It was possibly the most disturbing thing that had ever happened to Marcus Chen. His entire understanding of human motivation was built on the assumption that money was the primary driver of behavior. And yet here was a man who had money, not much perhaps, but clearly enough to live, who was choosing something else instead. The man was choosing integrity, choosing his son, choosing a vision of the future over the certainty of immediate personal gain. "The garage has to stay," David continued. "I've tried to work out of a normal workshop rental, but there's too much surveillance in those places. Companies have hired private investigators to figure out what I'm doing here. They've bribed landlords to get me evicted. I own this property outright, inherited it from my parents. And that's the only reason I've been able to keep working on this project without constant interference. Once I lose it, I lose everything. I lose the ability to develop this engine, and I lose the only way I know to teach my son what it means to work toward something bigger than yourself. Marcus returned to the engine, running his hand carefully across one of the cooling fins. The metal was cold beneath his palm, precisely machined, perfect. If I buy the land, that doesn't mean I have to demolish the garage, he said quietly. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact, and both men understood its implications. Marcus was thinking out loud, developing a new model, rewriting the script in real time. You could stay. The garage could continue operating. I'd file for a modification to the development plans. Instead of demolishing this property, I'd integrate it into the complex. Historic preservation angle, community character preservation, that sort of thing. The architects would hate it, the marketing team would need to be convinced, but it's technically feasible. David stared at him for a long moment. Why would you do that, he asked. You came here to force me out. You said progress was inevitable. Marcus turned to face him fully. I came here thinking I understood the situation. I was wrong. I'm not often wrong, and I don't particularly enjoy admitting it. But I'm capable of recognizing when I've made an error in judgment, and this is definitely one of those situations. He paused, then added, I need something from you in exchange, though. When this engine is ready, when it's truly perfected the way you and Thomas want it to be, I want first right of refusal to be the company that brings it to market. Not exclusive rights, because as you correctly noted, suppressing the technology would be counterproductive. But first opportunity. I'll commit to changing the company's approach to sustainability. I'll commit to implementing this engine across all product lines within a decade of acquisition, and I'll commit to doing it because your son asks me to, not because I'm convinced it's profitable, though I suspect it will be eventually. David's eyes reflected the LED lighting of the basement, and for the first time, Marcus saw something like hope flicker across his face. That's a significant commitment, David said slowly. I'd need it in writing, ironclad. My son would want to review it. Marcus felt something like amusement rise in his chest. You're serious? You want a 9-year-old to review the contract? David smiled. He understands the technology better than most engineers I've worked with. He's read my entire library, and he's more honest than anyone in my legal team would ever be. So yes, I want him to review it. Marcus nodded, understanding on some deep level that this was exactly the right response. A man who would submit major business decisions to his 9-year-old son was a man operating on a completely different moral framework than Marcus had ever encountered. It was not intimidating, exactly, but it was certainly foreign. All right, Marcus said, I'll have my lawyers draft the agreement tomorrow, but right now I'd like to meet Thomas. If he's going to be involved in this decision, I think we should at least be introduced. A smile spread across David's face then. A real smile, the kind that changed his entire expression. Come on, he said. He's upstairs in the office. He's been working on his own design sketches for the cooling system. You might actually find his ideas interesting. He's got a way of thinking about problems that completely bypasses conventional assumptions. The office above the garage was small, but comprehensive, and it had clearly been designed with a child's specific needs in mind. A desk sized appropriately for a 9-year-old sat beneath the window that looked out onto the parking area. The wall above it was covered with sketches, calculations, and notes that were sometimes neat, sometimes wild, always enthusiastic. Thomas Richardson was a thin, intense boy with his father's eyes and a nervous energy that suggested his mind was perpetually several steps ahead of his mouth. When David introduced Marcus, Thomas did not immediately accept the greeting. Instead, he studied the billionaire with an analytical gaze that reminded Marcus of the way a scientist might examine a new specimen. You're the man who wants to take our garage, Thomas said, not unkindly, simply stating a fact. Your shoes are worth more than my father makes in a month. You flew here in a private jet that uses the exact kind of inefficient fuel combustion we're trying to eliminate. Why should I believe you're committed to making real change? Marcus found himself smiling at the boy. There was something refreshing about the complete absence of deference. You shouldn't, he said honestly. You should assume I'm lying until I prove otherwise. That's actually quite smart, but I'm going to tell you the truth anyway. because your father clearly values honesty, and I'm trying to make a good impression on both of you. I came here today thinking that your father was an obstacle standing between me and a development project. I was entirely focused on profit and timeline. I didn't understand that he was actually working on something that could genuinely change the world. I still don't entirely believe that changing the world is possible, to be completely honest with you. But I'm starting to recognize that believing in the possibility might be important. So I'm going to invest in that belief, at least for a while. Thomas considered this response carefully, then returned to his sketches. Look at this, he said, gesturing to a particularly complex drawing. Dad's current cooling system works, but it's limited by the conventional fin design. I've been studying bioluminescent patterns in deep-sea organisms. They release energy in incredibly efficient ways. If we could adapt that principle to heat dissipation. He trailed off, apparently realizing he was moving too far ahead in his explanation. But Marcus found that he actually wanted to understand, actually wanted to hear the rest of Thomas's idea. And so for the next hour, Marcus Chen sat in a small office above a dilapidated garage and listened to a 9-year-old boy explain his revolutionary concepts for improving combustion efficiency. Thomas was rigorous in his thinking, patient in his explanations, and completely indifferent to the fact that his audience was one of the wealthiest men alive. At one point, he pulled a book from the shelf, a massive technical manual on biomimicry, and showed Marcus passages that he had clearly annotated himself, with notes in careful child's handwriting, working through the implications of various biological processes for mechanical application. Marcus had not read technical literature that challenged him in years. Most of what landed on his desk had been pre-digested for him, simplified to the point where critical thinking was barely necessary. But Thomas's ideas, while presented in the disorganized manner of childhood, contained genuine insights that made Marcus's mind work in ways that had grown dormant. When David returned with 3 sandwiches for lunch, clearly a daily ritual, Marcus realized that he had completely lost track of time. His security team had texted him 3 times. His assistant had called twice. The world outside this small office, the world of billion-dollar deals and corporate power plays, had become somehow less important than understanding the precise mechanism by which bioluminescent organisms could inform mechanical design. They ate together, the 3 of them, and Thomas told stories about his school, about the teacher who didn't understand why he kept trying to explain his engine ideas to the entire class, about the other kids who thought he was weird. David listened to all of this with the kind of attention that Marcus suddenly recognized as genuine parenting. He asked questions not for the sake of asking, but because he actually wanted to understand what his son was experiencing. He was fully present in a way that Marcus's own father, a pharmaceutical executive who had been too focused on empire building to notice that he had a son at all, had never managed. After lunch, Thomas showed Marcus something else, his personal journal, handwritten, filled with sketches and calculations dating back several years. Here was the evolution of his thinking, the gradual development of more sophisticated ideas, layered with drawings of engines but also drawings of trees, animal, mathematical patterns. Thomas was not just interested in solving the technical problem, he was trying to understand the fundamental principles of efficiency that nature had solved millions of years ago. Most people think engineering is about making things, Thomas explained. But really, engineering is about understanding how things work naturally, and then figuring out how to replicate that understanding in new contexts. Dad taught me that. Marcus looked at David, who shrugged modestly. That's just the history of technology, David said. Humans invented airplanes by studying birds. We invented waterproofing by studying how duck feathers shed water. We invented structural design by studying how trees distribute weight. Everything we've actually improved comes from paying attention to how nature already solved the problem. This was the philosophy that had driven David to maintain his garage, to reject every offer, to continue working on this engine, despite the constant pressure from companies trying to acquire it. He believed that the solution came not from money or power, but from understanding principles so deeply that the application became inevitable. Over the next few weeks, Marcus found himself commuting to Pennsylvania, in patterns he would never have predicted. He was cutting into his schedule, canceling meetings, rearranging his entire life in ways that his executive team found completely mystifying. His CFO tried to present an argument about opportunity cost. Marcus shut him down immediately. Some things could not be quantified in simple financial terms, he heard himself saying, and he was astonished to realize that he actually meant it. He spent time in the garage workshop, initially as an observer, but gradually as a participant. His understanding of mechanical engineering was theoretical at best, but he was a capable learner, and more importantly, he was genuinely interested. Thomas acted as his primary instructor, despite the age difference, and their relationship developed a natural rhythm. Thomas would show Marcus a concept. Marcus would ask questions that forced Thomas to examine his assumptions more carefully, and, in the process, both of them would develop deeper understanding. David watched this relationship bloom with something that Marcus could only describe as gratitude, though it was complicated by other emotions as well. A quiet wariness that suggested he was waiting for the billionaire to reveal his true intentions, to prove that his commitment was temporary or conditional. The agreement that Marcus's lawyers drafted was indeed and Thomas did review it, making several comments that his father's legal team acknowledged were actually quite astute. The document committed Marcus's company to prioritizing the engine's development, to investing in the infrastructure necessary to manufacture vehicles that incorporated the technology, and to doing so within a specific timeline that was ambitious but theoretically achievable. In exchange, Marcus received exclusive rights to the first implementation of the technology for a period of 7 years. After that, the patents would revert to David, and other manufacturers could license the design if they chose to. It was not the kind of deal that would typically make a billionaire wealthy, because the financial opportunity had been distributed in a way that prioritized the integrity of the project over the maximization of profit. And yet, when Marcus signed the papers, with Thomas and David as witnesses, all three of them sitting at the basement workbench with the engine between them, he felt something like peace. It was a foreign sensation, one he struggled to name, but it was unmistakably present.